Honourable Speaker, it's always good to get up in this House and speak to government initiatives such as this, Honourable Speaker. It's sort of, as my colleague from Surrey Wally I think, thoughtfully, and I think he's wrong. I want to say to him, because he's here sitting beside me in the House, that he's wrong, that my understanding is every time he gets up to speak, the ratings go up. That's my understanding, Honourable Speaker. And one of the reasons for that, people from around the buildings here especially, turn up the volume, turn off the mute button, and listen carefully to what he had to say, because what he had to say was thoughtful and I think cut through in rapier-like fashion the fallacy of, for example, what the Minister of Transportation said in question period, which is, quoting skillfully, and it's someone that the Minister of Transportation will be familiar with because, of course, he was one of those people in the buildings, and I know whenever Gordon Campbell spoke, it was mandatory to have the volume on loud in the Liberal Research Office in the 1990s. Honourable Speaker, my colleague from Surrey Wally amiably pointed out what is obvious, which is that we oppose the budget, not because we oppose every line item in the budget, that would be ridiculous, and yet it's regularly and it's started on a daily basis by the Liberal cabinet, which should know better, but that the vote on the budget is a general vote of confidence in the government and on the government's economic and social direction. And we, of course, Honourable Speaker, voted against that, because I have to say, in 10 years in the legislature, this was one of the most out-of-touch, empty, and self-absorbed budgets a government has ever produced. So naturally, we voted against it. Now, Bill 10, the Budget Measures Implementation Act, Honourable Speaker, puts into legislative form some of the initiatives in the budget. The government didn't need, Honourable Speaker, and I think people out there will be interested in that, didn't need the Budget Measures Implementation Act to continue to make the tax system more regressive by jacking up medical services premiums. They didn't need to use this mechanism, Bill 10, the Budget Measures Implementation Act, to do that. They were able to do that and to contradict what the Premier had said in the weeks leading up to the budget, all on their very own without legislation. Honourable Speaker, they didn't need, Honourable Speaker, the Budget Measures Implementation Act, for example, to claw back bus passes from people with disabilities. They didn't need this mechanism. Only the mechanisms that require legislative change are included here in the Budget Measures Implementation Act that we're talking about. And the signature event in the budget, the signature moment for the government, and I know this because unlike some members of the legislature, I read the throne speeches, Honourable Speaker,
it's in there,
and I keep them in a place, Honourable Speaker, and because I know that somebody at GCP worked hard, Honourable Speaker, and their budget has gone up quite significantly, and so we want to see if we get value for money from that. Honourable Speaker, that's the Government Communications branch. But if you've been reading the throne speeches and the political pronouncements on which every Liberal member of the legislature ran in the last election, what we're talking about here, the creation of an LNG fund, is the signature measure, the signature priority of the Liberal government. That's what they said, Honourable Speaker. They said things like $100 billion. They said things like get rid of the provincial sales tax. They said things like retire the provincial debt, Honourable Speaker, as a result of the LNG policies of the government. That's what they said. That's what they promised. That's what they committed to. And this fund was going to be the signature piece, the mechanism by which this happened, Honourable Speaker, was the fund that is contained here in Bill 10. And Honourable Speaker, I want to say this in a way that I think people can understand. What they were like, Honourable Speaker, is like a concert promoter who tried to sell 100,000 tickets to U2, and then on the day of the concert, everyone goes to the concert, they're very excited, Honourable Speaker, and K2 shows up, a well-known U2 tribute band. That is what we have here, Honourable Speaker. Or, alternatively, if you're a fan, as I know the member for for Kamloops South, Honourable Speaker, is a fan of the WWE. It's like, you know, getting a ticket, being sold a ticket by Vince McMahon, Honourable Speaker, and showing up and expecting to see The Undertaker, and The Underfaker comes through the curtain, Honourable Speaker. This is precisely what it is, Honourable Speaker. Or buying a book on cooking, Honourable Speaker, which I'd be interested in, Honourable Speaker. And expecting and thinking that you bought a book by Julia Child, and it turns out to be a book by Fred Child. Honourable Speaker, it's a little like, and we're talking about the Liberal government, so I think I was giving them too much credit with the U2 thing. It's like showing up for an Air Supply concert, Honourable Speaker. Air Supply, Honourable Speaker, and getting, instead of that, Air Deny, an air supply tribute ban. I'm sure one exists. And if it does exist, I'm sure the Minister of Transportation has seen it, Honourable Speaker. I could reflect on Jerry Grisham, Honourable Speaker, the famous mystery writer. You know, Annette Christie, any other things that you can think of. Because what they promised, and this was their signature promise, it was in every leaflet, it was on their TV ads, it was on the side of the bus. They promised a fund from LNG revenue that was going to do all of these things. And today, as the signature piece, Honourable Speaker, in the Budget Measures Implementation Act, the signature piece, we get this. No revenues from LNG. None. They've created a phony fantasy photo op fund. That is what they've done. They have so little respect, Honourable Speaker, for the voters who listened to them in the last election, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, not everyone did listen. Half of people did, but lots of people did. So little respect and so little desire to be straightforward that they created the fund anyway. I mean, this is the day that they were debating this, when AltaGas said they weren't going to proceed with LNG in British Columbia, Honourable Speaker. And you would think that that action would have some effect on the LNG fund, the Premier's fund, her signature achievement. But ironically, Honourable Speaker, it has no effect. That not going ahead has any effect because this fund has nothing to do with LNG revenues. It comes about, it's delivered as a creation, a figment, Honourable Speaker, a tribute band to a real fund by the Minister of Finance, Honourable Speaker. Honourable Speaker, the Colonel Pepper of the government, perhaps, Honourable Speaker. He, Honourable Speaker, I must say, he, Honourable Speaker, you know, they almost get it right. We were looking for Sergeant Pepper, we got Colonel Pepper, Honourable Speaker. And, Honourable Speaker, he has created a fund, Honourable Speaker, that doesn't exist. They put $100 million in the fund, and where'd they get the money? Well, they got it by overcharging hydro customers with a phony tax increase, Honourable Speaker. They did it by overcharging ICBC customers, and we'll be getting to that in a sec. They did it, Honourable Speaker, by increases in MSP premiums. Okay? So this is a regressive tax fund that they've created, a regressive tax fund that's created solely for public relations reasons. There is no purpose for its existence. There's no purpose for its existence. There's nothing the government can do tomorrow that it couldn't do today because of the existence of the fund. The sole reason is that the Premier and the Minister of Finance are embarrassed that what they said, not 100 years ago, not when the Premier was Deputy Premier in 2002, but a couple of years ago, has proved to be absolutely wrong. Because, Honourable Speaker, as you know, international markets affect these things. And the suggestion, and it doesn't matter how relentlessly you use government ads to advertise it, and partisan ads to advertise it, that there is a real impact by international markets. And my colleague from Surrey Wally ably, even brilliantly, laid out, I think, the circumstances, the realities of the LNG market internationally, Honourable Speaker. And rather than this fantasy fund exists in this piece of legislation today by the government, Honourable Speaker, for the sole purpose, Honourable Speaker, of allowing them to claim there's a fund, to claim income when none exists already. They maybe got the idea from their BC Hydro policy over the last number of years, where they have used systematically deferral accounts, Honourable Speaker, to create the illusion of profit where none existed. So money could be transferred and the government's balance sheet could look artificially good. That they could use such measures to increase and to jam ICBC and BC Hydro customers to subsidize the government's action. So this is the principal measure in this Bill 10. This is the signature moment in the budget. And rather, Honourable Speaker, than being straightforward, they were not straightforward, Honourable Speaker. You know, and this is the result of this, that they would rather not admit that what they said 2 years ago has turned out to be completely wrong and misleading. Because it would raise, I think, the suggestion as to whether they knew at the time that it was completely wrong and misleading. That's the issue that's being raised. So here we have this contrivance, Honourable Speaker, this $100 million contrivance that is the government's priority at a time that it's clawing back bus passes for people on disability and not taking action to support in any substantial way rural communities. You know what they have for rural communities? They have a fund for $75 million over 3 years. It's $25 million in the next 3 years smaller than the Premier's fantasy fund. That's all they have at a time when rural BC is struggling with those very same losses on the commodity side. And the only thing they care about is the effect of commodity prices on the Premier's reputation and not in rural BC.
Shame.
That is what has occurred here, and that is what we are debating, and that is what we are voting on in this House, Honourable Speaker. It shows a disconnect between the reality of British Columbians, including the thousands of jobs lost in forestry and the thousands of jobs lost in mining, and the government and its concerns. Because commodity prices have also hurt those people who've lost their jobs. They've hurt those people, and they get nothing from the government while the Premier digs out $100 million for this charade. It's an embarrassment to British Columbia, and it should be an embarrassment to the government, Honourable Speaker. Now, Honourable Speaker, there are other, of course, measures in this, and I've been asked by my colleague who is leading the discussion on this bill, my colleague from Tory Beacon Hill, the finance critic firm for the NDP, to speak a little bit about the issue related to ICBC. I know that the minister is here in the House, and I am looking forward, I must say, to discussing these issues at great length with him, both in the several days of committee debate that I would expect to have with him on this question, and then, of course, in the estimates debate following, Honourable Speaker. And that is, of course, that the government is proposing to change ICBC's fiscal year, Honourable Speaker, which will now end on March 31st instead of December 31st, and making changes to when it produces its annual report. And this is an interesting question, this question of ICBC. Because, and I'll get to the specifics of why it's significant that the government is choosing to change the date of the fiscal year and the timing of the fiscal year. Because ICBC, strangely enough, people may not realize this, and I'm, of course, here to learn all the time, Honourable Speaker, that ICBC, in fact, operates on several different years, depending on how you look at their books and how you look at the way they function. There's really three types of years they have, Honourable Speaker. They have kind of a policy year, an accident and sort of statistical year, and they have a fiscal year. And this one changes the latter. The interesting thing, I suppose, about ICBC, and the extraordinary thing, and people will know this, I know, Honourable Speaker, you're well aware of this as an experienced member of the legislature. ICBC was the creation of the NDP government of the 1970s, the Barrett government. And its creation led to occasional demonstrations, Honourable Speaker, against the government. I recall it well, actually, Honourable Speaker, because my dad, some people will know this, was an insurance agent. He ran his own business, and he was, I think, in that case, one of the 1% of insurance agents who supported ICBC at the time. And there was a very intense debate, and I recall a very intense time when he spoke out about that at a public meeting. But it was very interesting what happened, of course, because in spite of all the criticism of Mr. Barrett, who was the Premier, and of Mr. Strachan, who interestingly was a former leader of the NDP who became a cabinet minister in in the Barrett government, who was the minister responsible for ICBC. And of course, the Social Credit Party and the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party of the day viciously attacked the government around the question. Then, of course, it is a fact that since 1975, when the NDP government left office, for a majority of those years, alas, there have been right-wing governments in BC, and none of them have chosen to get rid of ICBC. And I think it shows how far-sighted the initiative by the Barrett government was. I just am reminded of one of the most enjoyable speeches, of the many enjoyable speeches by Dave Barrett in the legislature, Honourable Speaker, where he talked about this. He talked about the Social Credit government's decision ultimately to proceed with ICBC, and basically in the form at that time that the NDP had left it. And he said, Barrett said as follows: "I don't have too much to say on ICBC, other than to say that those raving socialists over there have gone too far. They have expanded the program to a degree that is shocking even in the Soviet Union. They have embraced government-owned car insurance as if it were their own child, and as foster parents, they have denied all maternal and paternal responsibility. As one who has suffered from vindictive slings and arrows of mad opposition who scream doom and gloom about the government insurance business, let me say with some humility, welcome to the Socialist Club," Honourable Speaker. And of course, through those times, ICBC has been critical in British Columbia, both for providing access to auto insurance, pursuing public initiative of road safety, Honourable Speaker, and of course, especially in recent years, where the government has used it as a cash cow, a significant source of positive revenue and capital for the government. And so these were important things that occurred. And really, ICBC, until 2010, functioned in that way. There's a very thoughtful thinker on these questions, Richard McCandless, who's a former public servant who writes in BC Studies and other things about public policy issues. And he talked about what happened. Because in 2010, of course, Honourable Speaker, and this directly relates to what we're doing today, the Liberal government, Honourable Speaker, under then Finance Minister Colin Hanson, who we occasionally hear on the CBC, Honourable Speaker, these days, speaking for the government, he confirmed, Honourable Speaker, and I'm quoting Mr. McCandless's piece, very thoughtful piece about the history of ICBC, he confirmed that the government over 3 years, in 2010, would take $778 million of ICBC's excess capital from the optional capital reserve and dividend in order to reduce provincial borrowing costs. During the 36 years of its operation, most citizens would regard the corporation as a not-for-profit supplier of low-cost insurance, similar to its predecessors in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. In fact, the legislation did not permit a transfer of its funds to the government. Henceforth, any reserve capital greater than the optional MCT target would be considered as a dividend for the benefit of the taxpayers, rather than a way of reducing premiums. So we've heard this a little bit in the House in the last week from the Minister responsible for BC Hydro. I'm sure we'll hear it when I discuss the Minister responsible for ICBC, where they criticize past governments, Honourable Speaker, for keeping rates low. In other words, for returning BC Hydro's profits to citizens, returning ICBC's profits to citizens, whereas their approach has been to bring them in so that they can finance tax cuts for the rich, Honourable Speaker. They've compared those approaches, and I like that comparison. I look forward to those debates, Honourable Speaker, because it seems to me that what's happened is we've transitioned ICBC into playing its role as a Crown corporation, all of the ways it's going to do, to a role of simply saving the Liberal government at election time. You will recall, and I mentioned this, Honourable Speaker, for example, that the policy year of ICBC, which is an important question, Honourable Speaker, was changed in 2013. Now, get this. If you remember, 2013 is an election year, as 2017 will be. They changed the policy year from April to November. Why would they have done that? The member for Vancouver Point Grey, very thoughtful on these questions, can reflect on the year and when elections are held. They're actually fixed election dates in BC. And he can probably advise me as to when elections are held and why they might have moved the policy date, the policy year, from April to November at that time. They did it, Honourable Speaker, of course, for only one reason: to cover up and to hide the truth from the voters of British Columbia. That's why they did it.
Shame.
Honourable Speaker.
Shame.
And so now we have a policy year, November, and now they're moving the fiscal year to cover the fiscal year of the government, Honourable Speaker. And this has, some challenges, Honourable Speaker, right? Because, as you know, the policy year used to be a couple of months ahead of the fiscal year and 10 months after the close of the last year. This is when we're setting rates, Honourable Speaker. It's now 5 months ahead of the fiscal year. and 7 months after the close of the prior year. And, Honourable Speaker, this means, Honourable Speaker, that the estimations that the government make will be less precise. It has an advantage, of course, Honourable Speaker, and these are issues we'll be discussing in the 2 or 3 days of debate I'll be having with the Minister at committee stage, Honourable Speaker. But it has some advantages in terms of moving the fiscal year in line with the government's fiscal year, Honourable Speaker. But it does have some disadvantages for ICBC, which I think will be considered. And one of the most important disadvantages is that over time, over its decades of operation, since the early 1970s, they've operated on one round of fiscal years. And now, Honourable Speaker, magically going into an election year, we'll have the opportunity to do it over 15 months and make comparisons much, much more difficult, which, when you have a terrible record, is a good thing, I suppose, and that's why the Liberal government may be so encouraged to go forward this time. And when you have a good record, that would be a bad thing. So we'll guess whether the record is good or terrible by the action that the government is taking, Honourable Speaker. But what's happened at ICBC, and what happened this past year, is surely a profound lack of accountability. What we saw this past year is the minister, we had this sort of what we call a sort of a political operetta starring the minister, Honourable Speaker. Maybe more like, I don't know, Honourable Speaker, Joe Verdi instead of Giuseppe Verdi. But in any event, Honourable Speaker, to continue our theme, Honourable Speaker, where the minister pretended in August that ICBC was proposing an outrageous rate increase was beyond this, and he was going to wrestle it to the ground, Honourable Speaker. They've tended to wrestle it to the ceiling. He was going to wrestle it to the ground. And he was going to get his pencil out and his abacus out, Honourable Speaker, because they got rid of all of the computers in his office. And, Honourable Speaker, he was going to, Honourable Speaker, wrestle those rates to the ground. And you know what he did? He didn't do anything of the sort, Honourable Speaker. In fact, their management of ICBC has seen costs go up dramatically overall, and they're doing a whole other song and dance to justify that, Honourable Speaker. What he did was he took from the optional side of ICBC, not reviewed by the BCUC, of course, he took $450 million and gave it to the basic side. That was his reform. That was his pencil work. He was able, Honourable Speaker, to say, you do this, take it over here, and then I will have brought the rate increase down, Honourable Speaker. That is the reform that was brought in by the government 5 years after the previous reform, which changed the whole basis and mandate for ICBC, 3 years after the other reform around fiscal years that allowed them to hide the situation through the 2013 election. And now we have a new process, a 15-month fiscal year, Honourable Speaker, to make it more difficult to hold them accountable. I think we're still going to try, I say to the member for Surrey-Whalley, I think we're still going to try. In the upcoming days of debate on this bill, Honourable Speaker, will give us our first opportunity to consider doing just that. So, Honourable Speaker, in conclusion, what do we have to say about this piece of legislation and this government's budget? That it's out of touch with the people of BC, that could not be clearer, Honourable Speaker. The actions, the small actions with respect to the housing market ignore the significance and challenge of housing facing every group of people in Metro Vancouver and in other parts of the province as well. It's a budget which fails to recognize what's going on in rural BC, the incomes challenges people face in rural BC. We hear the government bragging about long lineups of people lining up for work, Honourable Speaker. Well, that tells you something. The government's own budget numbers, which dramatically reflect, Honourable Speaker, the decline in relative terms of the resource industry as a source of revenue to the government. A dramatic decline, Honourable Speaker. Virtually, as a share of the provincial budget, a quarter of what it was before. A dramatic decline in those industries. You cannot hide that. You cannot say, we're the resource industry government, and then see that kind of decline, which reflects, Honourable Speaker, a double whammy for rural and resource communities that have lost services as a result of that decline and have also lost jobs as a result of that decline. And you respond, Honourable Speaker, with a 3-year slush fund around an election that barely, that is $25 million smaller than the slush fund they created for the Premier personally. Out of touch, Honourable Speaker, with what's going on. Out of touch, Honourable Speaker, on the issue of MSP, which though it is not in this piece of legislation hovers over this piece of legislation because it finances the key item, the Premier's Fantasy Fund, in the legislation, Honourable Speaker. So all of these things, Honourable Speaker, show why members on the opposition side voted so clearly against a budget from a government that's out of touch, that is more used to dealing with deputy ministers and receptions and satisfying elite concerns than dealing with the concerns of real people. And you see that reflected in this piece of legislation, Honourable Speaker. You see it reflected in the direct actions the government is taking and not taking, Honourable Speaker. And you see it, I think, in the arrogance and contempt that the government expresses to those that simply disagree with it. We, Honourable Speaker, will look forward to continuing this debate extensively at committee stage. But in closing, Honourable Speaker, I want to say this, that this is not the way you do things. I think, we as legislatures have an obligation to treat the public with respect. When there is not LNG revenue available, you don't create a fund and pretend that there is, Honourable Speaker. There was a fund created in the end of the 1980s, in the declining days of another government, Honourable Speaker. It was called the Budget Stabilization Fund. Its acronym, Honourable Speaker, was the BS Fund. And that fund, Honourable Speaker, was an example of a government, a right-wing government that had run out of ideas and had lost touch with the people of BC, Honourable Speaker, an example of what not to do. And it was rejected by people. And thankfully, the government that came in after it got rid of the BS Fund, Honourable Speaker. And this fantasy fund has no more real money in it than that BS fund. It has other commonalities with the BS fund, but it doesn't have, the commonality is not money in the fund, Honourable Speaker. This reflects the same thing. A government that is playing fiscal games, Honourable Speaker, rather than being clear and straightforward with the people of BC. Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker.